Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. On today's episode, I am so thrilled to be joined by best-selling author Elodie Harper to discuss her new novel, Boudicca's Daughter, a thrilling, epic historical tale that tells us the story not of the British rebel queen Boudicca, but of her eldest daughter, Selina, an extraordinary woman who faces immense challenge and grief with a boldness and courage some could only dream of. Elodie is a writer who worked for many years as a reporter at ITV News and as a producer at Channel 4 News. She has since written 4 books. Her much-loved Wolf Den trilogy has received wide acclaim. The first book in the series, Wolf Den, was a Book of the Month for both Waterstones and Barnes & Noble. It won the Glass Bell Award and was shortlisted for Page Turner of the Year at the British Book Awards. The second in the series, The House with the Golden Door, was a Sunday Times Top 10 bestseller. Her latest standalone novel, Boudicca's Daughter, is out now and published by Head of Zeus in the UK and by Union Square & Co in the US. Here to chat all about it, welcome Elodie to A Pair of Bookends.
Hey, lovely to be here.
It's so lovely to have you. Now, before we dive into your book, which I absolutely loved, but we will get onto that, I do like to start by asking what you're currently reading.
Well, I'm reading Wayward by Amelia Hart, and it's absolutely wonderful. I am just loving the different perspectives, how they weave together. Yeah, it's brilliant. Can't recommend it enough.
I've heard so much about this book and I've still not got round to it, so maybe this is the nudge that I
It's your
needed.
sign.
I was actually quite surprised because in prep for this episode, I was listening to a couple of interviews that you've done on other podcasts, and I listened to one of my favourites, A Novel Evening, which you did way back in 2022, and you mentioned having read Akatar, and I don't know why that really surprised me. I don't know why I thought like, oh, you must be immersed in your own, in historical fiction, in mythology and all that kind of stuff. But to see that you were reading romantasy, I was like, okay, so is your reading taste quite varied, would you say?
Yes, it definitely is. I think, yeah, I think if you read just one type of book, even if they're all brilliant, yeah, it's not quite as exciting as reading like a vast range. So yeah,
Yeah,
I enjoyed Akatar, and I enjoyed, all different genres
yeah.
really. Sometimes I just want to be reading some crime thrillers or some cozy crime, or just genres completely different to mine. I'm a huge fan of Claire Douglas, who writes incredible psychological thrillers. So I
Yes.
always enjoy her books. Mainly, I mean, I must admit, most of my reading is like non-fiction stuff about romance. So maybe that's also why I like to read a lot of different stuff too.
It's
Because,
heavy on the research.
yeah, it's heavy on the research. I mean, I do love it, so it's not like a chore, but
Yeah.
it's quite intense and
So I
something.
think when you're reading for pleasure, it needs to be maybe away from the genre that you write.
Yeah, I mean, I have sometimes I'll read in the genre just for pleasure, but I also am lucky enough to get sent a lot of amazing proofs,
Yes.
which tend to be all in my genre.
Of course, yeah.
As well. So yeah, so when I'm sort of choosing a book that's not a proof, I tend to go a bit outside the box.
I love that, and I think it's such a treat as an author or to be in the bookish world and to get sent proofs and early copies of things.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's
It's a
very
very nice treat to receive. But let's get into your book, which, as I said, I absolutely loved. And yeah, I think we should start by maybe you introducing Boudicca's Daughter to the listeners.
well, you gave a very kind introduction already, but yeah, so I wanted to focus on the daughter of the famous queen. With the Temple of Fortuna, the end of the trilogy for the Wolf Den, I focused on the aftermath of Mount Vesuvius, and I think this is what really interests me as a writer, is not just retelling the big events, but diving into what the psychological impact was. So, in thinking about Boudicca's daughter, it was both to redress what I feel is quite a historic injustice to both her daughters, who played such a key role in the rebellion, but Their names have not been recorded. We know almost nothing about them apart from the fact that they were attacked, and that's what spurred their mother on to retaliate against Rome. So I didn't like the fact that there are these women who played this really pivotal role in history, and yet their stories just revolve around this one moment of victimization as a catalyst, like not really giving them humanity or agency or any kind of complexity, really. And there are quite a lot of tales in the ancient world where women are used like this, like the rape of Lucretia, or, where it's the woman's sort of suffering is kind of a plot device rather than part of her own story. So there was that element. And also just, from a family drama, human perspective, what would it have been like to have been Boudicca's daughter, both the admiration and then the darkness of her legacy, and how she would relate to both her mother's personal and political impact in her life after. And I also, obviously I'm a big ancient Rome nerd, and this period of history, thinking about, Rome as an aggressive colonizer and the way that they did that and the impact on the people whose countries they took over and how that was not a simple relationship. So I think, the rebellion can feel very simplistic. We could see it as sort of heroes and villains. I didn't want any kind of heroes and villains. I mean, obviously the Romans were the aggressor, so there's an element of that. But it's also, much messier, the aftermath, when it's not just purely resistance. You have to find other forms of resistance. How is Selena going to accommodate or resist Rome? How is she going to, build a life in this new world where her people have been defeated? So all of those elements kind of really interested me as to why I would choose to write about Boudicca's daughter, I think.
When did you first come across Boudicca's story?
I think when I was very young, and like a lot of girls, in primary school, I was like, yay, a queen who went to war. And then, and like scared the Romans, and she's kind of portrayed as this sort of ferocious figure, awe-inspiring. There's that statue of her and her daughters outside the Houses of Parliament. She's such an iconic figure. But then when I sort of read a bit more about it, I was like, oh, she literally burnt cities to the ground, and there would have been mass casualties. And that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of problematic, to put it mildly. And I don't mean that in an anachronistic way. Obviously, the ancient world was incredibly brutal. But I do think when we use the ancient world to tell ourselves stories about ourselves, it's important not to idealize figures. It is for me anyway. So I was really intrigued by Boudicca, and I didn't want to have her as all hero or all villain, but as a sort of complex woman with many different motivations. And I also thought, this kind of view of history where individuals are so powerful. I also, in the way that I retold her rebellion, were there points where actually she lost control in the sense of, the events had their own momentum. If she'd have wanted to stop, could she have stopped? Probably not. It reaches a certain point where you have to continue. So I wanted to look at that as well and how she might have psychologically coped with what she had created.
How did you find it? Because you've obviously mentioned that there's so little on these women in the history books. So how did you find that in terms of research? Did it actually give you, was it a positive in that it gave you a lot of freedom to sort of fictionalize her story? Or, did it make it quite difficult in terms of, trying to seek out details of what life might have been like specifically for her and her family?
Yeah, it was a bit of both actually. So I think on the main it's a positive. So I do quite like to look at characters about whom we might have a little bit in the historical record, but not masses. So like in the Wolf Den, the women of the Lupana, we've just got fragments of graffiti, just some of their names, and then you've got the context of what their lives might have been like, but who they were as individuals, is very murky. And similarly with Selena, I mean, we've got a bit more about her specifically, though we don't have her name, unlike the graffiti. There's this sort of bare bones of her story in one snapshot point in her life. We don't actually know her age. I pushed her age to the absolute upper plausible limit because, I didn't want to be writing about horrible things happening to children. So for me, it's quite exciting to have more scope to surprise myself and the reader by what I create rather than with a retelling. I think, writers take different approaches to this, and, I'm a huge fan of retellings as a reader, but as a writer, I like to be able to make up the plot much more I like to have a lot more license with the plot.
Yeah.
So having less on her life was really useful. The context in terms of the Iceni people was initially quite daunting because they didn't leave any written records, unlike the Romans. We've got these incredible, beautiful artifacts, like coins and sort of fragments of chariots, and just this kind of misty sense by
Hmm.
piecing together other kind of Celtic peoples of that time and sort of Celtic myths that were told later in Ireland and
Hmm.
Wales, some kind of sense of this culture. But we also have from the Romans, I think, this information that sometimes gets quite brushed aside, really, which is that the women in these societies could wield really significant military and political power.
Hmm.
So Tacitus says they don't distinguish between the sexes when choosing commanders when he describes why Boudicca led the rebellion. And I think there's a bit of a tendency in history to imagine that the women were always oppressed and, had like this miserable existence with the
Hmm.
men who was in charge. And, the sort of dominant narrative of Rome, they were a much more patriarchal system
Yeah.
than ancient Britain seemed to have been. So it was also something really interesting for me to look at the Iceni tribe and not idealize them, but to think about the ancient world where women did have more power
Hmm.
and what that power might have looked like. Not kind of fluffy and feminist, but they could be brutal commanders. They could lead a rebellion. They could have that level of self-assurance, of violence, of conviction. And Boudica was not the only queen in ancient Britain at this time. There was Cartimandua, who led the Northern Brigantes tribe based in Yorkshire. And she took an opposite path to Boudica in that she accommodated with Rome and she took money from them. And, her motives, like who was right in the end? Did she protect her people
Hmm.
better? What happened to the Iceni was appalling after the rebellion. Whereas for Cartimandua, her people would have been largely left alone until she was overthrown.
Yeah.
So, yeah, these different ways that women wielded power.
I do want to ask you about the fact that Selina's family are part of this British Iceni tribe. That's how you say it, isn't
Yeah,
it? Iceni. And her father is it a druid? Is that how you say that?
yeah.
I was really interested in their sort of relationship with kind of spirituality and the gods. Could you talk a bit about those things and what they kind of represent in this world? And yeah, why they might have like a kind of deeper connection to the gods than say we might have.
So men and women could apparently both be druids in this kind of culture, and there's some debate as whether Boudica herself was a druid or and Prestitargus, that was his real name. His name actually means magic chief. So I have no idea if he was a druid or not. I mean, the druids, exactly how they worked, who they were, is quite hazy because it's come to us through the Romans. But they held enormous influence in terms of their connection to the gods, also their sort of their learning, so their ability to prophesize, to communicate with the spirits and the gods. And they were also like the repository of a lot of the learning and the wisdom and the justice and the legal system. So it's hard to think of an equivalent in the modern world. But what I wanted to look at is, in the case of Prasutagus and Selena, is to what extent did people truly believe this themselves? Because there's an element of manipulation going on,
Mm,
not necessarily malign. Did people really think they were talking to the spirits and the gods? Or did they tell themselves this and half believe it and half not? We
mm,
never really know with Prasutagus quite what he believes about his own powers. But with Selena, she's aware that she isn't likely speaking to the gods because they're not answering her in the way that she believes they're answering her father. And yet she still believes in the gods. So I wanted to create this kind of quite ambiguous system where the magic and the spirits are hugely important, but actually the people right at the top of the tree, the druids who are, kind of the gatekeepers, how much do they really believe? How much are they aware of the idea that some of it's coming from, as Presentagus says, from my, did it come from the gods or did it come from my own mind?
mhm.
So I wanted to think about that. I think in terms of the way that their magic and belief system worked, it was hugely rooted in nature. So things like the solstice, summer and winter, and there's evidence of how they built their buildings in terms of where the sun would fall at certain times.
Yeah.
And the gods were very much linked to aspects of nature, like the river, the force of the river, the sun, the seasons, So I think it's hard because they haven't got a written magical or religious system.
Mm,
It's hard to know exactly how those belief systems worked. But like I say, there are sort of later legends that were recorded, like the Mabinogion in Wales. And there's a female character, that Rhiannon, who is probably linked to the horse and spirits goddess Epona. So yeah, I hope that doesn't sound too confusing as an answer, actually. But
No,
yeah, it was a kind of a mishmash. And then the reason why I chose to write the Druids as quite ambiguous in what they believed and how real the spirits were to them was also because I'm a huge Pliny the Elder fan.
a huge what fan?
Pliny the Elder fan.
Oh.
And he was quite unusual, but in the natural history, he says quite a few things that are pretty atheist. Like there's no greater God, that,
Mhm.
that chance and fortune show that God has no power, basically. And also that there is no life after death was something that he writes about in the natural history, which was not a standard belief. So I think it shows that although we tend to think of people in the past as kind of blindly religious and superstitious and much less rational than we are, I wanted to explore the fact or the possibility that maybe they were conscious of the fact that some of these things may not have been real.
It is very interesting, how her relationship with the gods, she really believes that. I mean, her father tells her, I'm trying to think of like how I can say things without spoilers. But her father tells her that not everything is necessarily, it's not that it's not true, but it's, you can sometimes embellish the truth a little bit.
Yes.
So she plays with that, and she can kind of use that to her own advantage later in the book, and I just love that. But she still has this trust in the gods, doesn't she? Because she
Yes.
prays to them, much later in the book when certain things happen, she puts all her belief in them, and she's like, I'm really relying on you right now, like please make
Yes.
what's happening better. So it's just interesting to see the way her relationship kind of grows and changes with the gods throughout the book. I do want to return to her family story because I think, yes, it's a historical tale, but like you said before, there's a lot of complex family dynamics in there, which I absolutely loved. And Selena has a complicated relationship with her mum, who is Boudicca. And she even says at one point, I know exactly why she will never love me as much as Belenia. Is that how I say her
Yes.
name?
Yes. Yes.
Belenia is, yeah, Selena's sister. What drew you to exploring and really diving into the dynamic of this family?
So, in all honesty, like that is the main draw point for me is human relationships. In all
Mm.
my books, it's about character, it's about relationships. It's sort of kind of the psychology of people that is kind of more interesting to me than pretty much anything else that I write about. So,
It's what connects us all, isn't it? So,
yes.
yeah.
And the Boudiccan Revolt as a family drama really, really interested me because this was not just a political rebellion. It was caused by something incredibly personal, and intimate and kind of violation of one specific family. So you mentioned ACOTAR earlier. I'm a
Yes.
massive fantasy fan and I love Lord of the Rings. And I was always incredibly drawn to the complex dynamics of Denethor, Steward of Gondor, and his two sons, Boromir, who he idolizes, and Faramir, who he devalues. And although that is not the dynamic of what's happening with Boudica and her two daughters,
Hmm.
I wanted to think about that idea of, when there is a favoritism, why
Yeah.
there's a favoritism, how that impacts the whole family. And also, it's not because it's not like let's blame the mum time. It's
Yeah.
a dynamic that's caused by both the parents. So
Hmm.
this is a little bit spoilery, but it's hard to get into it without. But each parent has a favorite child. So
Yes.
Selena is her father's favorite child. She's actually more like her mother.
I thought this.
And she even looks like her mother, whereas Belenia looks like her father. But Prasutagus loves his eldest child, Selena, the one that he believes has the gifts of the Druids and is
Hmm.
going to be his heir, and the one that the one who listens to him, who idolizes him, who is, highly intelligent. And then what role does that leave Belenia when she arrives, the younger daughter? So it's in a sense that Boudica, the mother, one of her children has already been chosen by the other parent. So she chooses the younger child. So it's a question of how much agency Boudica has in that family dynamic as well. And the dynamic between the two sisters, they really love each other. So although this impacts them, I didn't want it to be a kind of like bickering, horrible relationship with the sisters. They're very different people. And in many senses, they are not the people that their parents have projected onto them. So, Katia projects her strength onto Belenia, but in fact, Belenia is much more vulnerable than she
Yeah.
can accept. and it is Selena who has her strength.
Hmm.
And, similarly, Prasutagus doesn't seem to see the ways that Selena is so similar to her mother. And then with Boudicca and Prasutagus as well, they love each other very much, but there's darkness in that relationship too, and questions of manipulation and power play and all sorts of stuff that then later plays out in Selena's main romantic relationship, the ways that she echoes how her parents treated each other
Yeah.
in how she interacts with the man in her life.
Hmm.
So that was something I wanted to think about as well, because I do think that, that's quite a thing, how family dynamics then play out into your own adult life.
Absolutely. And that is something that I'm so fascinated by. I think about it quite often, and
Yes.
I feel so drawn to a complex family dynamic in
Yeah.
fiction. It's like my favorite thing. um, and as the eldest daughter in my family, I was thrilled. As the eldest daughters rise up, I loved that this story was told from an eldest daughter's perspective, because I think there can often be a lot of pressure on the eldest daughter's
Yeah.
shoulders. And I thought you portrayed that really well. Are you an eldest daughter?
I'm actually a youngest daughter.
Oh, wow. Plot twist.
I know.
But you've experienced this kind of family dynamic, and
Yes, I'm one of three, and everybody has different roles in the family,
yeah,
and yes, it's very complex, and the ways that parents' relationship with each other
yeah.
impacts how the children relate to each other and relate to the parents. And I think one of the things that Selena comes to terms with over the course of the book is that she is, as her aunt puts it, the child of both her parents.
Mm,
She's very like both of them, and she's also like neither of them. She's herself.
yeah.
So it's dealing with the legacy. I mean, we don't know who Prasutagus is now. We've heard of Boudicca, but the fact that her husband's death and the impact that had on the family isn't such a well-known part of the myth. But of course, for Selena, both her parents were hugely important, and Prasutagus was a massively powerful and important political figure who made
Mhm.
different choices to Boudicca in attempting to accommodate Rome, much like Queen Cartimandua in Yorkshire. So yeah, it was thinking about her relationship with both her parents, even after they're dead, and how that continues to impact her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you were saying before, there's so many elements of her personality that are so similar to her mum, as in Selena. And, Selena really has her mum's sort of boldness and strength and bravery. There's a quote that I've got. I'm sorry for reading your work back to you continually, but there's a moment that really fascinated me, and it's Selena speaking about the Roman settlers. And she says she has no patience for my interest in the Roman settlers who have seeped into our country, embedding themselves in the land like leeches. They invaded when my sister and I were small children, and now I cannot remember life without their shadow, their casual violence, and endless theft. We were raised to hate them, and I do, yet unlike Bologna, the invaders also fascinate me. And I thought this was such an interesting part of Selena's character, in that she has this fascination about them.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about what
Yeah.
might fascinate her?
So I think this was one of the things I wanted to explore about what it might have been like to encounter Rome as a colonized person in the ancient world, and the ways that Rome was both, an oppressor and hated, but also people embraced aspect of Roman culture. They were obliged to accommodate Rome. They didn't get much say in it. So then that's amplified for women who, were also often married off to the oppressive kind of invading people. So for instance, in Colchester, which Boudicca burned, there's a lot of evidence that some of those families were like Roman men and British women, and their children would have been both Roman and British. And how consensual those relationships were,
Yeah.
or how consensual they might have later become, because people adapt to their circumstances. And I think it's an incredibly uncomfortable topic,
Hmm.
but it was so central to women's experience back in that period.
Yeah.
It's the founding myth of Rome, this idea that, the Romans stole the Sabine women and married them. It's not a romantic story. But then, how do the Sabine women respond to that? And do we judge them for how they respond to that? So there was that aspect of Selena's story, but also she's a really curious person.
Hmm.
And with Selina and Paulinus, the Roman general who she later meets, she's captured by him. With both those characters, they have a really biased and reductive view of one of each other's cultures in many ways. I mean, Selina is forced to understand Rome far more than Paulinus is obliged to understand her culture because she's part of the people who are being conquered, so she's has to study them. But part of the book is this greater understanding that the pair of them have of each other, of difference, and of being less prejudiced, I suppose, as to who the other is and why. So yeah, with Selina, I thought it would be more interesting if she was someone who was curious about Rome rather than just blindly hating everything about Rome, because
Mm,
obviously she does go to Rome. She is taken to Rome in the second half of the book, and she has to accommodate Rome in many, many different ways. So the fact that her relationship with Roman culture is extremely conflicted and that she's
mm,
both interested by it, fascinated, occasionally admiring, sometimes loathes it, sometimes thinks it's deeply inferior to her own culture.
mm,
And that was something that I really wanted to write as well, to see Rome through other eyes, particularly when she's at the court of Nero, to see the way she perceives how that court operates versus how her Iceni power structure operated. And of course, she's incredibly biased. So she's not, she idealizes how her world works versus this alien world, just as Paulinus, the Roman general, idealizes Rome and devalues the Iceni culture. So that was something I wanted to look at, from having different point of view characters, viewing one another's worlds, one another's cultures, one another's custom, with both fascination and repulsion.
That I wanted to ask you about, because we haven't really touched on Paulinus apart from just now, but he is obviously part of the story is told from his perspective, as you've just touched on.
Yeah,
Not a lot of the book is, but I'd say a good part of it is. A
yeah,
good portion of the story is told from his perspective, and you just kind of said, some of the reasons why you wanted to share his perspective, but his perspective isn't told in the same way that you tell Selina's perspective, if that makes
yeah.
sense. Could you talk a bit about those choices that you made?
Yes. So that was really complex, actually. That I wanted multiple points of view in this book because I felt it was a really complex story, and it was important to see it from different angles. So the first section of the book is split between Selina, who is first person, and Selina is always first person
Hmm.
because it's essentially her story, and Katia, who is her mother Boudicca, because Boudica is kind of a war title that she takes on later. Her actual name is Katia. And the reason I did that actually was partly to try and take ownership of such a famous character and humanize her and see her as a real woman, and that Boudica becomes a symbolic name, and it's an identity that later consumes her, but it's not all that she is.
Hmm.
So the first part of the book is the mother and daughter, and then after Boudica's defeat, it moves to split between Selina and Paulinus, the Roman general who defeated Boudicca and takes Selina captive. The reason I wanted to include him, and initially in the first kind of draft of the book, I had Paulinus from the beginning. So we had his view of the rebellion. And then I cut all that because it just destroyed, in a sense, the tension of discovering who he is through Selina's
Mm,
eyes. And also, I just thought I just want to be completely immersed in the Iceni culture for this first second, just like Selina is, and not
yeah.
have Rome intruding. But he was important afterwards for seeing the rebellion from Rome's perspective in all its brutality, and trying to make him more than just a kind of cardboard villain,
Hmm.
really. I mean, the way I imagined Paulinus was essentially as a kind of, in the modern world, he'd be more of a bureaucrat, civil servant type character rather than somebody who delights in violence.
Hmm.
And his story as a historical figure is actually really interesting and ambiguous and morally grey in its own right, because the book, it felt important to me that I wanted to look at different types of rebellion and unrest. So, without too many spoilers, the book goes up until the Civil War, the Year of the Four Emperors in Rome, which Paulinus played a key role in as a general. And his role in that war, Tacitus is baffled by it. Everyone's kind of baffled by what he does and why.
Mm,
And I don't want to go into too many spoilers, but sort of thinking about him as a character in his own right, how he might have been impacted by the violence he inflicted and the violence he saw was also interesting to me, because although, Romans don't have words for things like PTSD or trauma or whatever, that doesn't mean that war was not deeply traumatizing to
hmm.
people. And so, yes, with both Selena and Paulinus, they are opposites, and yet they also have some very similar experiences, and that's extremely uncomfortable, sorry, for both of them to come to that realization of the ways in which they're similar as well as the ways in which they're different.
Yeah, and I think it helps you seeing it from both of their perspectives, that it's not necessarily the kind of individuals that are at fault. You know, it's not the people on the ground that, yes, they may be enacting violence and stuff, but also they don't really have a choice. It is a kind of, you know, it's the powers that be and the people that are kind of overseeing them that are the ones that are going, well, if you don't do this, you're going to die, your family's going to die. So it was really interesting to see the kind of moral ambiguities of that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, Paulinus doesn't have that excuse really with the rebellion, although you could say that he's kind of a cog in the system. In the Civil War, yes, I wanted to explore that aspect of how much agency does he really have. And his understanding of his own lack of agency is like really key to his development as a character. But yes, it was also just thinking about how the cycle of violence and aggression, counter-aggression, more aggression, how that just keeps going regardless of the people enacting it. It just has its own unstoppable momentum after a
Yeah,
particular point.
yeah,
And yeah, so Paulinus felt important from that point of view. I don't agree with Paulinus. I'm
yeah.
much more I'm much more on Selena's side, obviously. But I didn't want him to just be a monster. Also, because that would be really horrible to write and really horrible to read. If
Yeah.
just some evil sadist who took her captive for his own, gratification or whatever. That would be a hideous story to endure as a reader or a writer. Whereas he's deeply hypocritical,
Mm,
essentially. And he's had to develop this very hypocritical way of thinking. And I hope it doesn't give too many spoilers, but what was quite key to explaining his relationship with Selena from his point of view is when he says to her, oh, the way he treats her personally with courtesy versus how he treats her in his role as an agent of
mm,
Rome. These are different. One is justice, that's the word he uses,
yeah.
obviously. We might have views, and one is courtesy. So that's how he justifies to himself the terrible things
Mm.
that it's justice. It's not personal. He's not doing this to be cruel.
I think, as you've said as well, that there are no kind of straightforward heroes and villains in this book. It's a bit more messy and nuanced than that. I do want to ask you as well, this is a very grief heavy book. There is a lot of loss, unimaginable loss, and there was actually a point in the book, I don't know what I expected, but there is there is a point in the book where I literally like stopped and like was literally gobsmacked. You know, my hand went over my mouth. I couldn't believe that something had just happened. I was so thrown by it. I was so devastated by it. How do you find killing off characters?
Yeah, I hate it. And I mean, there were a couple of deaths, and I mean, yeah, I think I personally was unprepared for the level of grief I was going to have to grapple with in writing
Yeah.
this. Because when I pitched it and when I planned it, I didn't think about what it would really mean to write about the Iceni Rebellion because it is quite, iconic and legendary and the heroics. And there are heroics and adventure and kind of daring do, really naff phrase, but yeah, I don't know how else to put it. But it is an adventure story in some ways.
Hmm.
And I have some sort of heroic moments and excitement and all the rest of it. But actually, war is appalling.
Yeah.
And it respects no one, and
Mm.
anyone can die, and anyone can die really pointlessly as well. I think that was something I wanted to convey that death in war is not heroic. I mean, I'm very far from the first writer to make that point, so it's not an original one, but it's still a really important one.
It is.
And the implications of that for a family, and also what that means as well in terms of survivors like Selena can be quite stigmatized because it's like, oh well, they were cowards, or they accommodated, or they didn't resist enough. There's glory in death and in resistance, and Boudicca's famous speech, which she may most likely didn't actually say, but it's in Tacitus about, but better to die than be enslaved. Is it though?
Mm.
Really? Is death so great? Is it braver to survive? And in fact, Selena has that conversation with a Roman woman, because I had to give her a bestie because I can't cope with women not having besties in
Yeah.
books. So she later gets a bestie in Rome, and yeah, who has also been through grief.
Yeah.
And it's they have this conversation about the strength it takes to survive, to not give up, to not die, basically.
Selena says at one point, and I don't know if it's the same point that you're talking about, but I noted down, what has my life been if not endurance in the face of loss? Is that what
Yeah.
you were talking
No,
about?
that's what she says to Pliny when she's furious with him, when
Oh,
he's
well,
kind
different
of,
point.
yeah. Yeah.
But I thought
No,
that was a
but
really
it's the
powerful
same.
quote, yeah.
But it is the point. That's yeah, and that's also what she says to her bestie Paula, because but in a different context. So I think yeah, the level of grief. I mean, I actually skipped one of the deaths in particular and had to write it almost at the very end of the book because I found it so unbearable to write. And I am conscious of that. And the only thing I can say to readers who are like, is there's a lot more in the book than that. And I hope it's ultimately a very hopeful story. It's also quite exciting. There is a lot of adventure. And certainly in the relationship between Paulinus and Selena, there is, I think, quite a lot of unexpected humour because of the ways they misunderstand each other and interact with one another. I wanted that to have an element of humour. And yeah, and the drama of Nero's court. So there's a lot of stuff in the book that's not grief, but the rebellion aspect, yes, that's about loss. It's also about the loss of a culture because they lost everything.
Yeah, I don't want I don't want to give the listeners the wrong impression that it is just a very kind of depressing book, because it's absolutely not. I thought this was such a thrilling novel, and it's so much adventure in there as well, and there's all these complex family dynamics, and we see Selena's journey, and there's a lot more to it than grief and sadness, but this is quite a savage world that they're inhabiting.
Yeah,
So
savage. Yeah, and I mean the Wolf Den trilogy, anyone who's read the Wolf Den trilogy will be well aware
yeah.
I kill people off. And sometimes it's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I do tend to put readers through the ringer emotionally, but there are always high points as well. And I think part of the high is just the ingenuity and the resilience and the tenacity of the characters and how they cope with this world.
Don't know if this is too much of a spoiler if I don't mention characters, but did you intend to have such a popular romance trope in there as well?
That was the enemies to lovers trope. Part of me thinks maybe we should. Yeah, how can I talk about this? Yeah, so there is a popular romance trope in the book. Dealt with in an extremely unusual way, I
Hmm.
would say. And initially, that was not my intention. But in writing the book, that was what felt like the most psychologically plausible way to
Mm,
deal with what was happening in
yeah.
those characters' lives. So it's very much not idealized, it's not romanticized, but it felt psychologically plausible to me.
Mm,
Of the experience of women in the ancient world and how they might have coped, and
yeah.
men in the ancient world too. So.
Yeah.
And it's also, you mentioned there's a lot of grief and loss. So, if I had made this purely a revenge saga and nothing else than a revenge saga, I don't know, that would have also been extremely bleak.
Hmm.
Both revenge and redemption have a big psychological cost. How you deal with such a profound injustice as the one Selena has suffered. It's a profound injustice on every single level,
Yeah.
personally, culturally, politically. I mean, it's an injustice which can never be forgiven.
Yeah.
You cannot atone for it. Paulinus, no Roman can atone for what they've done. But what does Selena do with that injustice? How does she personally cope with it?
Hmm.
So yeah, the popular trope was partly about exploring that rather than I thought, I'll stick that in.
It's just a happy accident.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about survival, isn't it?
It's about survival,
Yeah.
yeah. And
And what we
and
do to survive.
and what we do to try and be happy as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's similar to the Wolf Den too. In writing about the Lupana, it's not only, just all bleakness and woe, because I think as human beings, we are always we want to be happy.
Hmm.
We struggle not just to survive, but to love.
Yeah.
To be loved, to have a family. And how is Selena going to do that in this new world? So, much like the women of the Wolf Den who find family in each other, because where else are they going to find that family? So
Yeah.
I think that's also what was going on there is just, people tend to try and escape the bleakness of their lives, not wallow in it, and to find happiness and humor and lightness even in grief.
Absolutely. I absolutely adored this book, and I could speak to you for hours about it. But we can't give spoilers, and I think we've done very well in terms of navigating those.
There you have it. Yeah.
You've had the Wolf Den trilogy. This is a standalone. What's next?
So I can't say exactly what's next. It's not been announced yet, but I am writing it at the moment, and I'm
You're
really
writing something
excited
new.
about it. Yeah.
That's very
I
exciting.
can't wait to share it when I've got more.
Well, I can't wait to hear all about it, and I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Elodie. Before I let you go, I do like to finish by asking for a recommendation. So is there anything that you would like to recommend that you've either watched, read, listened to recently? Anything goes for this recommendation.
So this September, there is the most incredible book coming out by Nikita Gill called Hecate, which is the first in her Goddesses of the Underworld trilogy. It's sensational. I can't praise the book enough. It's, the story of the refugee goddess who goes to the underworld and the adventures that she has, and it's phenomenal.
This sounds amazing.
Yeah,
Adding that to my pre-order list. Thank you so much, Elodie, and thank you for this wonderful book. Thank you for joining me and chatting to me about it. Yeah, I absolutely loved it, and I love chatting to you, so thank you.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. It's been so nice to chat to you too.
Thank you. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. You can find us at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Elodie, where can the listeners find you online?
So I'm on Instagram as Elodie L. Harper, and that's really my only active social media account. I do have a Substack as well, which people can subscribe to. But yeah, as terms of social media, it's Instagram.
Amazing. I will link your Instagram and your Substack and your website in the show notes. And I will also put links in the show notes to grab yourselves a copy of Boudicca's Daughter, listeners, which is out now in both the US and the UK. Go grab yourselves a copy. Go give Elodie a follow. And thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.